I will begin in just a few minutes. Much of my narrative is based on my book. I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's At the Glacier's Edge, a natural history of Long Island from the Narrows to Montauk Point. And it basically tells the story of six different habitats: grasslands, forests, the salt marshes, beaches, maritime waters, fresh waters like the rivers of Long Island, and also the geological story and some of the environmental story too, which proves to be very important when we talk about eco-restoration. So without further ado, I am going to get started. So I'd like to tailor my talks to the places where we are. I'd like us to think about where we are. What is here now and what was here then? I'm sure the local history buffs in my audience have asked the same question. That's probably most of you. But let's dig deeper. What is the ground that lies beneath our feet? How solid is it? On a map, we are in the city of Long Beach on Long Island's South Shore. In an aerial view, as in this map, we are on a barrier island, part of a string of barrier islands enclosing the Great South Shore Estuary. Let's go even deeper still, into geological time. That shoreline you see was once much further out to sea. The barrier islands that enclose our South Shore were fluid creations of sand and sea, continually shape-shifting and migrating inland as sea levels rose. In fact, the South Shore Estuary was formed a mere few thousand years ago when sea levels, which had been rising since the retreat of the last glacier, began to stabilize. As the sea flowed in, islands emerged. An archipelago that includes Manhattan Island, Staten Island, and of course the largest, Long Island. Barrier islands, like Long Beach, also formed, enclosing shallow water bays known as estuaries. Dunes formed on the seaward side of the islands, and marshes formed on the landward side. And I'll talk about both of these habitats. We cannot appreciate the ecological value of our coastal habitats without knowing how they evolved and how all its components, barrier islands, salt marshes, beaches, dunes, tidal waters, fit together. So let's begin at the beginning with Long Island's geological story, which is where I always love to begin, and then we'll go on a virtual tour of Long Island's wild South Shore. Let's start with a walk atop the crumbling bluffs of Montauk Point, the easternmost point of both Long Island and New York State. I've walked here year after year, over 2 decades, and observed the bluffs give way, first by inches, then by feet, to the onslaught of the relentlessly rising sea. I photographed the bluffs to chart their regress through the years as fissures cut ever deeper inland and their edges slumped, disgorging boulders they held for thousands of years. From our vantage point atop the bluff, we have a sweeping view of the Atlantic, a deep blue on sunny days and silvery on cloudy days. When it's clear, you can see the Connecticut coast and Block Island. The sea that now laps at the base of our bluff and covers the continental shelf was not always so close. At the height of the last glacial episode, around 22,000 years ago, sea levels were some 350 feet lower than today. Long Island was not an island then, but part of the exposed continental shelf that extended over 100 miles to a distant sea. It was literally at the glacier's edge. Where we stand at Montauk Point is a moraine created by a glacier as it melted back. The end point of the glacier, its terminal moraine, is now lost beneath the sea, submerged a submerged pile of rubble, marking the farthest south a glacier advanced across our island. All of Long Island's topographical features were sculpted by glacial advances and retreats. Two prominent moraines define its ridges. The Harbor Hill moraine runs across Long Island's northern coast, and the Ronkonkoma, considered the older of the two, extends eastward across central Long Island to Montauk Point. They overlap on the western end. As you can see, the land south of the terminal moraines was ice-free, a vast wind-swept plain called by geologists the outwash plain because it was formed from tons of sediment sluiced by glacial meltwaters. In fact, Long Island is a creation of ice. Most of the island's rivers and streams flow in ancient glacial meltwater channels. Most of its ponds and lakes are kettle holes formed when blocks of ice broke off a receding glacier and melted in place, enclosed by glacial rubble. Those huge boulders you see on some of our beaches, those are called glacial erratics because they were broken off from places far distant, ferried here, and deposited by glaciers. In fact, the types of rock can tell us where they came from and can help us trace the path of the glacier. Cobbles exposed at low tide on many of Long Island's beaches are glacial drift, and even the sands are eroded grains of glacial rocks. Over tens of thousands of years, multiple glaciers surged southward, reaching as far as Long Island. The land at the glacier's edge was a vast tundra, laced with a network of icy meltwater streams and pocketed with bogs and black spruce swamps. A landscape browsed by mammoths and mastodons, now extinct, and herds of caribou and elk. These herbivores were in turn stalked by carnivores like the timber wolf and dire wolf, and by 12,000 years ago, the omnivorous human hunter. Around 12,000 years ago, a huge lake impounded by the Harbor Hill moraine on Long Island's north shore broke through its morainal dam in what must have been a catastrophic flood, scouring out the channel now known as the Verrazano Narrows. The Hudson River, which had been diverted by ice to flow through New Jersey, now roared back into its ancient channel, eroding a deeper and deeper canyon as it rushed across the continental shelf to the sea. On the map, you can see the Narrows and Hudson River Canyon in deep blue. And notice on the right side of the map, the ancient barrier islands already forming offshore 12,000 years ago. As you can see in these photos, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge now spans the Narrows, connecting Long Island to Staten Island. Cruising by boat beneath the bridge, you are taking the same route Hudson did when he entered what would become New York Harbor and sailed up the river named after him. Today, the Hudson Canyon extends 350 miles past the continental shelf and reaches depths of over 2 miles, a kind of underwater Grand Canyon. The largest submarine canyon on our Atlantic coast, it harbors an amazing diversity of marine life, from bluefin tuna, endangered sea turtles and whales, to deep sea corals, and is now being considered as a national marine sanctuary, which I hope it becomes. The story of Ice Age Long Island is a story of advancing and retreating glaciers, of falling and rising seas. From that story, we learn that our shorelines have been forever shifting in response to natural processes. When glaciers advanced, sea levels fell hundreds of feet. When glaciers melted back, a process that took thousands of years, all that frozen water was released and seas rose hundreds of feet. In the huge expanse of geological time, the process was rapid. But in the much briefer expanse of our human lifetime, the process was slow. Although the breaching of the Harbor Hill moraine at the Verrazano Narrows would have happened suddenly and catastrophically. Today, daily tides and seasonal storms continually rearrange the sands. Winter northeasters and summer hurricanes strip the beaches of sand, depositing it in sandbars just offshore. In calm periods, waves transport that sand from the offshore bars back to the land, rebuilding the beaches. It's a fairly balanced cycle of erosion and redeposition, but sometimes, when storms are severe and storm surge is high, powerful waves scour the beaches, depositing the sands in deeper water where they cannot be reclaimed. Still, these are natural processes. But if one factors in human-induced climate change that is accelerating sea level rise, and our shorefront development that prevents the natural migration of barrier islands and marshes landward, our barrier islands and beaches may simply disappear beneath the waves. Let me read you an excerpt from an historical account of Coney Island to illustrate the natural processes that have altered our shorelines over centuries. In his History of Long Island, Benjamin Thompson, who grew up on Long Island in the early 1800s, related a story of how Coney Island was temporarily drowned during a northeaster. Quote, "In a terrible gale which occurred upon the coast on the 26th of January, 1839, the whole of Coney Island, with the exception of a few sand hills, was completely inundated by the sea. The basement of the Ocean House was filled with water. The bridge was carried away. Several small vessels were cast on shore, and one was driven a considerable distance toward flatlands." Thompson was describing a storm surge, a temporary phenomenon, but he also learned from old-timers that the sea appeared to be advancing on the island over time. He cited several anecdotal accounts, such as that of 79-year-old Court Lake, whose, quote, "grandfather, about 110 years ago, cut a quantity of cedar posts upon a part of Coney Island, which is now 2 miles in the ocean, and that he himself cut firewood at a place now 1.5 miles from the shore." What Thompson was describing was the gradual landward migration of the barrier island, which Coney Island was before the water separating it from the mainland was filled in. Shorelines have always shifted in response to natural forces such as tidal action and seasonal storms in an ongoing process of erosion and redeposition. But now, in a time of accelerating sea level rise, combined with our hard shoreline developments, we are blocking the natural migrations of our shores and salt marshes. Before it was developed, the entire South Shore was, in the words of Thompson, quote, "almost entirely a line of hillocks, hills of loose, drifting sand, like drifting snow heaps." Another Long Islander and Thompson's contemporary, Daniel Treadwell, described, quote, "the continuous exchange of sand dunes and ocean strand," end quote, that he traversed on the barrier island of Long Beach, a wild place of dune and beach and marsh that he found beautiful. Quote, "The eye cannot penetrate the length of these dunes westward. They melt into the horizon, and their magnitude is intensified with an endless variety of form. These sand hills have an individuality. They are unlike any other hills. They are miniature mountain ranges, as unstable as the waves of the ocean, beating at their base." Treadwell also described what he called deep and watered valleys between the dunes. These were the swales of dunes, no doubt covered with bayberry, beech heather, and beech plum. Here in this elemental landscape, Treadwell found a sense of solitude that was, quote, soothing in its silence and stillness. To experience some of that silence and stillness, let's visit one of the most pristine and oldest dunes on Long Island. These are the walking dunes of Napeague on Long Island's South Fork. They exist on what was once a waterway, hence the Montaukett name Napeague, roughly translated as drowned land, that separated Montauk from Amagansett. Yes, Montauk was once an island, but over the millennia, sands eroded from the moraines filled in the waterway, creating an isthmus, now known as the Napeague Isthmus. Dunes are creations of wind. A single tuft of beach grass can serve as what is called a wind shadow, behind which a dune may form. American beach grass, which sends down deep, extensive roots, will spread from the dunes to the upper beach, capturing more sand in their wind shadows, creating new dunes. The seaward dunes are the primary dunes, the landward dunes are the secondary dunes, and so on. Between primary and secondary dunes are swales. Where the water table lies close to the surface, bogs and marshes form, and on the swales' upper reaches, maritime forests take root. They are called walking dunes because they have been migrating in a southeasterly direction, pushed by the prevailing northwest winds. As they migrate, they alternately smother and uncover maritime forests. And what is called a blowout, ancient tree stumps may be revealed. It's a glorious landscape of creamy white dunes that you can best explore on a winter day when you don't have to worry about ticks. You can hike a trail that takes you in a circuit through maritime woodland, wetland, bog, and of course the dunes themselves, following a sandy path through grasses and bayberry bushes. For myself, despite ticks and mosquitoes, I do go well protected. I like to visit in May and June, when the beech plum breaks into frothy white flowers and the heather blooms in golden swathes on the dunes. Braving the mosquitoes in June, I venture into bogs in search of orchids and wild cranberries. Yes, there are bogs in the sand dunes. Colonies of grass pink brighten the bog with their showy amethyst blooms. Look closely and you will find flowering amidst these orchids, but somewhat hidden by them, wild cranberries, once called craneberries because of their flower's resemblance to a crane's bill. Look more closely still, eyes to the ground, and you may find flowering sundews, their stalks covered with sticky hairs that capture insects. On the harbor side of the walking dunes is a beautiful protected stretch of beach, one of my favorite places in the world. Advancing and receding tides have sorted the sand grains from fine to coarse, distributing them in wavy layers like a sand painting. Purple grains of garnet, charcoal grains of magnetite, yellow gold grains of quartz. Rusted iron particles in the sand impart a coral tinge. The tides have also piled up mounds of pebbles, sandstone, quartz, granite, each telling a story of its glacial origin when a river of ice transported the rock from distant lands. Their time in the sea has smoothed, rounded, and polished them. The beach brims with life, though it's not immediately apparent to the eye. Let's look more closely. A pebble serves as a holdfast for bright green seaweed. It is also studded with stacks of slipper shells, inert and apparently as lifeless as the rock, but in fact very much alive within their overturned shells. An exposed boulder bristles with the sharp cones of northern rock barnacles, again seemingly inert, but very much alive. As larvae, these crustaceans attach themselves to hard substrates like the boulder, head first, secreting a strong glue to cement themselves firmly. Once attached, they grow their shell houses, 6 chitinous plates that enclose themselves in a protective cone, and 4 plates at the end of the cone that open and shut like trap doors. They close these doors to conserve moisture and to defend themselves against predators. When the tide washes over them again, they open and thrust their 6 pairs of feathery legs, or cirri, into the water to feed on plankton. At the shoreline, sea wrack has been deposited by the receding tide. If you stir the wrack with your foot, so-called beach fleas may jump out. These are not fleas, actually, but amphipods, tiny shrimp-like crustaceans that feed on decaying seaweeds and grasses. These herbivores, in turn, make good snacks for foraging shorebirds that, like ruddy turnstones and plovers. The endangered piping plover nests in the sands here in small colonies. Their nests are mere shallow depressions in the sand, easily predated by raccoons, feral cats, and loose dogs. Because they are so vulnerable, their nesting grounds are fenced off and protected during their breeding season. Walking down the beach, we come to the mouth of a tidal creek that winds through the marsh, through the dune swale, and empties into the bay. Here we find the exposed sand flat riddled with holes. These are the burrows excavated by sand fiddler crabs. They digest the sand for food and regurgitate processed pellets, stacking them up like tiny cannonballs. They consume bacteria, algae, and detritus. They will hibernate in these burrows in winter, but in summer they emerge to mate, the males waving around their oversized claws to impress females and warn off rival males. As we walk down the beach, we might consider what lies beneath our feet. Between the grains of sand are millions of microscopic organisms known as myofauna that turn the sands, which only appear lifeless, into a living, breathing world. Even the minerals in the sand feed life, nourishing plants and animals alike. We cannot recreate the living biome that is a beach. Break one strand in the life web, and we can bring about a cascade of extinctions. Just as life feeds on life, life depends on viable living habitats. As beaches diminish, so too do the plants and animals that spend all or part of their lives in these dwindling coastal strands. And we as humans are part of that web, also consumers of marine plants and animals, also dependent on viable marine habitats, from the shallow estuaries that surround most of Long Island, including our South Shore estuary, to the deep offshore waters of Hudson Canyon. Estuaries like the South Shore estuary spanning Hempstead Bay to Shinnecock Bay host an incredible abundance of species. Geologically rare ecosystems, estuaries form in sheltered waters behind barrier islands or over drowned tidal rivers like the lower Hudson, where salt and fresh waters commingle. The balance of fresh and salt water is critical to maintaining healthy estuaries. Now, with climate change and rising seas, that balance is becoming disrupted. What has been designated the South Shore Estuary Reserve extends about 75 miles from the Queens-Nassau County line eastward to the village of Southampton, encompassing a 326 square mile watershed in Nassau and Suffolk counties. This map shows a portion of it, the Great South Bay. One of the most diverse estuaries in New York State. The South Shore Estuary Reserve was created in 1993 by act of the New York State Legislature. A new comprehensive development plan issued in 2022 indicates a sea change in our models of coastal development, working with, not against, nature. Habitat restoration is key to this way of thinking. Instead of hardening our shorelines, let's soften them, even undo the hard structures. Instead of immediately thinking bulkheads and seawalls, let's think berms and dunes. For those of you who lived through the devastation to our shores wrought by Superstorm Sandy in 2012, you were witnessing an extreme storm surge that inundated Long Beach and other seashore communities, the seething ocean dredging sand from offshore and dumping it onshore in what's called a washover. I personally visited Long Beach after the storm and saw the wreckage. The iconic boardwalk reduced to driftwood, streets and cars buried in seas of sand. Since that storm, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which I'll call USACE from now on, embarked on what they called a coastal storm risk management project to protect 6.4 miles of Barrier Island shoreline, including that of Long Beach City. Beaches have been renourished and dunes reinforced, a costly engineering project involving 3.2 million cubic yards of sand dredged from offshore, which according to the Corps must be repeated every 5 years to keep up with sea level rise. The elevated portions of the beaches, called berms, have been built up, and new dunes have been constructed. Not artificial dunes with hard cores, but natural dunes planted with 34 acres of dune grass and protected by sand fencing to retain dune sand. 18 existing groins, those rock structures perpendicular to the shore, were rehabilitated, and 4 new groins added, redesigned so as not to starve downshore beaches of sand, while at the same time retaining and trapping sand in order to lessen the need for costly beach sand renourishment. Besides beaches and dunes, the iconic Long Beach Boardwalk was also rebuilt. The results are beautiful, demonstrating how restoration can be both cultural and ecological at once. It's something Long Beach residents should be proud of. I mentioned earlier a sea change in our models of shoreline restoration, working with, not against, nature. Instead of building walls and bulkheads, we can create what are called living shorelines. These are more resilient against storm waters than bulkheads, but they are more appropriate for bayside and estuary shores that are somewhat protected from the direct onslaught of the sea. These illustrations by Noah give you an idea. In the picture on the left, we see a hard, bulkheaded shoreline. And on the right, we see a soft, living shoreline. Notice the fish, horseshoe crab, turtle, and bird, as well as dunes and grasses of the living shoreline, compared to the eroded seaward shore and near absence of wildlife of the bulkheaded shoreline. Living shorelines are simply those made of natural materials, including plants, sand, rock, and shell. Their components range from anything from offshore oyster reefs, which serve like breakwaters, to sand dunes, which absorb wave energy and allow natural migration of shores, to salt marshes, which provide vital fish habitat as well as buffering our shorelines. Because they are living shorelines, they grow over time, enhancing plant and animal life. And they provide green spaces and blue waters for people to enjoy. So let's continue our tour of Long Island's wild coast and venture into the salt marshes. Integrally connected to Long Island's shores and estuaries are our salt marshes, places that are at once terrestrial and marine. Like barrier islands, salt marshes buffer our shores from the sea's onslaught. They filter our waters of pollutants and serve as carbon sinks. They also serve as nurseries for many of our food fish species. Besides their utility, they are also, at least to me, simply beautiful natural places to explore. Recall Daniel Treadwell's memory of Long Island's dune-lined shores. Treadwell grew up on his father's farm in Freeport, and as a boy often accompanied the men who camped out on the barrier islands to go Martian, a time-honored communal tradition of cutting and curing salt hay from offshore marshes to feed cattle in winter. In his reminiscences of men and things on Long Island, Treadwell recollected the marshes of the Great South Bay like, quote, a hazy daydream with no recognition of time, a landscape unlike anything else in nature. And the creeks, the waterways are labyrinthian and present novelties at every turn unknown to the most noted rivers of the world, end quote. Treadwell was describing a landscape that had long disappeared in his lifetime. For thousands of years, Long Island's tidal wetlands supported an abundance of species, including our own. Hunters, fishers, shellfish gatherers, and marshers used this vital habitat sustainably. In the past century, the great seas of grass that graced our shores were severely fragmented, and they continue to be threatened by coastal development, pollution, and climate change. Let's look at those losses in numbers. In the early 1800s, Long Island's salt marshes comprised an estimated 70,000 acres or 100 square miles. By 2004, they had been reduced to 24,000, with the greatest losses in Nassau County. In New York City alone, wetlands have been reduced by an estimated 90%. How did this come to pass? Let's take a little look into history. Since the Dutch and English colonized Manhattan and Long Island, draining, filling, and building on what they called watery wastelands characterized shoreline development. The Dutch were renowned for their water reclamation skills. Their windmills were famous for pumping water from their own waterlogged lands. They transported their hydraulic engineering skills to New Netherland, expanding the Manhattan shoreline to create prime taxable real estate. This map was created by engineer Egbert Viollet in 1865 to show how the original waterways, wetlands, and shores of Manhattan had been built out and built on, placing residents and buildings in these low-lying wet areas at risk of flooding without proper drainage. Through the 20th century, what I call the fill and build model of development prevailed as our coasts were and continue to be built out and built on. But as we face the prospect of relentlessly rising seas and ongoing coastal erosion, we are reimagining our approach to shoreline development. Jamaica Bay serves as a case in point of this new approach. Jamaica Bay is an estuary, that is a shallow enclosed bay, clustered with salt marsh islands covering about 26 square miles. Originally, it had 16,000 acres of marsh. Between 1924 and 1974, 75% of these marshlands were lost, primarily due to dredging and filling. Since the 1970s, these losses have accelerated despite the Tidal Wetlands Act of 1973, federal legislation that sought, quote unquote, no net loss of wetlands in the United States. How did this come to pass? USACE conducted a study in the late 1990s to determine the cause and consider what could be done to keep the marshes from disappearing altogether. They attributed the erosion of the salt marsh islands to a complex of factors, including storm surges and washovers, nitrogen overload that caused toxic algal blooms and depleted the waters of oxygen, warmer waters, and accelerating sea level rise due to climate change. The Corps created a series of maps based on aerial surveys done in 1951 compared to 2003 and 2005. The erosion of the salt marsh islands in Jamaica Bay is dramatically illustrated in 3 of these maps. The red areas show the extent of the salt marshes in 1951, and the green areas show what was left by 2005. On their website, the Corps declared in 2023 that the salt marsh islands could be gone by 2025, that would be this year, if nothing was done. In work begun in 2006 and still ongoing, they undertook aggressive eco-restoration to rebuild the salt marsh islands, but they are in a race against time and sea level rise. It should be emphasized that the Corps did not undertake this work alone. It has been a coordinated effort that involved people at all levels, from the city to the state and federal governments, and included local citizen environmental groups like the Jamaica Bay Eco Watchers, the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy, New York City Parks, and importantly, local citizen volunteers planting hundreds of thousands of marsh plants. On a single marsh island, to take one example, 700,000 marsh plants were hand planted. It's an extraordinary effort that has staved off the disappearance of the Bay's salt marsh islands. Something to be applauded. The same partnership undertook in 2021 another Living Shoreline project. This involved restoring 2,400 linear feet of heavily eroded shoreline at the refuge with 51,000 cubic yards of sand to create 9 acres of marsh, restoring an additional 14 acres of shoreline habitat, planting 200,000 native coastal plants, and installing an offshore breakwater composed of 5,000 bags of discarded oyster shells donated by the Billion Oyster Project of New York City. To appreciate what we have lost and what we may regain through eco-restoration projects like those at Jamaica Bay, let's go back to explore the world of salt marshes. So how does a salt marsh form? Sediments flushed from the watershed form mudflats. Spartina grasses, the foundation of the marsh, root in mudflats and spread by rhizomes to form thick colonies. Decaying rhizomes and roots build peat beds that over time raise the level of the marsh in a process called accretion. Cordgrass and other salt-tolerant plants colonize the lower marsh, while salt marsh hay and less salt-tolerant plants colonize the upper marsh. Serving as the arteries of the salt marsh ecosystem, tidal creeks flush and nourish the salt marshes. Let's look more closely still. In the green world of cordgrasses at their roots, marsh periwinkles climb up the grass blades and scrape off algae as they go. In the mud, salt marsh snails, also called coffee bean snails because of their size and shape, forage on dead cordgrasses. Mud snails, also called dog whelks, graze on algae and detritus in the muds and scavenge dead animals in the shallow waters, like these scavenging a horseshoe crab. I've seen hundreds of these foraging in tidal creeks. Ribbed mussels bind the whole salt marsh ecosystem together and play a crucial role in filtering the water. They are a sign of a healthy salt marsh. Little fish spend their whole lives in tidal creeks. Atlantic silversides, sheephead minnows, mummichogs, and other killifish. And the young of larger fish, our food fish, use the creeks as nurseries and shelters. Juvenile striped bass, shad, and bluefish, which will return to the ocean as adults. All these little fish are prey for larger creatures, turtles and birds, for example. The diamondback terrapin is the only reptile whose exclusive habitat is the estuary and salt marsh, where the female lays her eggs above high tide line in shoreline dunes. It feeds on periwinkles, snails, crabs, worms, and mussels. Its eggs and hatchlings are prey for larger animals such as raccoons, foxes, crows, and gulls. Once hunted to near extinction for terrapin soup, it continues to be threatened by hard coastal development that eliminates dunes, as well as by pollution and habitat loss. For example, the creation of Idlewild Airport, now called JFK International, involved draining and filling a vast wetland. The airport's existence blocks the turtles' ancient migratory routes to their traditional nesting grounds. Hundreds have died trying to cross runways to get to their ancestral nesting grounds on an adjacent beach. Like the diamondback terrapin, once common birds that inhabit salt marshes were and have been threatened. Take egrets, once hunted to near extinction for their feathers. The name egret is derived from the French word for plume, aigrette, which were in great demand in the millinery trade in the 1800s and early 1900s, when fashionable women sported hats with plumes, feathers, and even stuffed birds. In 1844, J.P. Giraud, who wrote The Birds of Long Island and was himself a bird hunter, disapprovingly reported that the great and snowy egrets were being killed in large numbers for the value of their plumes. By 1910, the snowy egret was considered extirpated from North America and the great egret close to extinction. Alarmed at the egret's demise, Brooklyn-born George Bird Grinnell, yes, his middle name was Bird, led the fight to stop the slaughter of these beautiful birds. Boston society women joined forces with him, seeking to boycott bird hats. Helen Winslow's comment was typical, quote, "The place for dead birds is not above a pretty woman's face." This group became the core of the first Audubon Society, founded in Boston, Massachusetts in 1896, and other cities followed suit. The National Association of Audubon Societies was incorporated in 1905. The persistent efforts of the Audubon Society led to the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Let's turn to the shorebirds, which were also hunted, not so much for their feathers as for food. Most shorebirds migrate through in spring and fall, grateful to land and feed in salt marsh mudflats. One example is the greater yellowlegs. To bird hunters, it was known as the tell-tale tattler because its alarm call flushed other shorebirds into the air where they could be easily shot. The greater yellowlegs, because it forages alone as a rule, was not worth the shot, but flocking shorebirds in migration definitely were, like the dunlin. The dunlin was known to bird hunters as black-breast, as you can see in this picture. When flushed, a flock will fly up, wheel about in concert, then return close to where they had lifted off, making them easy targets for hunters. Hunting most shorebirds was banned in 1918 under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and by 1928, all shorebirds were protected from hunting. Let's not overlook birds exclusive to salt marshes. Several are quite secretive in their habits and easy to miss. John James Audubon described the clapper rail, which he called the marsh hen, thus in 1838, quote, "They have a power of compressing their body to such a degree as frequently to force a passage between two stems so close one could hardly believe it possible for them to squeeze themselves through." In Audubon's time, hundreds of nests could be found in the salt marsh in a day. Now we're lucky to find a few. A combination of sea level rise and habitat loss threaten the survival of another avian salt marsh dweller, the salt marsh sparrow. This elusive little bird secretes itself in the grasses, no sooner seen than out of sight. But on a hot July day at Oceanside's Marine Nature Reserve, I was lucky that one decided to show itself atop a snag, briefly, but just long enough for me to, quote, "get a shot," meaning a photo. I was lucky, and we are lucky, the threatened species is still with us, thanks to preserves like that at Oceanside. So why should we care about our salt marshes? We can enumerate some of their utilitarian values. They buffer our shores, they filter water's pollutants, maintaining water quality, they serve as carbon sinks. But besides their utilitarian services, salt marshes are vital habitats, living webs of interdependent species, including our own. As components of estuarial ecosystems, they are vital not only to our regional ecologies, but also to the local human economies that depend on healthy local ecosystems. Ecology and economy share linguistic roots. Eco from Greek, oikos, household. So how do we manage our earth household? I'd like to end with a quote from my chapter on salt marshes. "The human hand plays an essential role in both ecologies and economies. But unlike an economy in a free market world where the quote-unquote invisible hand regulates the economic system, ecosystems, once damaged or unbalanced, cannot restore or rebalance themselves." And I'll add a final word. We need the creative human hand to restore both nature and ourselves. Thank you very much.